Hey, this is Travis Marker with Steward Growth, and I'm with America Francis. She's the director of Steward Growth, and we're excited to present When Life Gives You Lemons. And as with most programs, we don't start off with a set outline of exactly where we're going to go, so we kind of do this a little bit podcasty. But we have had some people give us some topics that they have just wondered about, and so we're going to try to explore some of those today and see where it takes us. Um, America, why don't you start?
Well, let's talk a little bit about the premise of this group. Sometimes you have a plan for your life, and then something comes in and just completely wrecks it and throws you off track. And so this discussion is for people who might find themselves in that situation and really not know where the solid ground is or how to kind of move from the place they really don't want to be to someplace else that's better.
Correct. And I think actually all of us, 100% of there's a 100% chance something will happen when your life is off track.
Yes.
It's like a guarantee. I think on
Well,
my
there's
side,
some adjustments that are easier to make than others. So, when we talk about transitions, some transitions are expected, like parenthood, or if your kids move out and you're empty nesters, or even just graduating from college. And they can seem like really great events, and people can celebrate those. And sometimes they'll really focus on the positive things, which is great. But then maybe you have two types of feelings. Maybe you have some fear along with your excitement. And sometimes those feelings don't get explored as much or supported as much. Getting a new job can be really stressful. Or if things happen in combination, let's say you have a job loss at the same time of a really great event, and you're just struggling with keeping your
conflicting.
systems and routines. And we've talked about identity before. Like, how does this change who I am?
Yeah, correct. Because even sometimes conflicting emotions become problematic, right? Or you have the birth of a new baby, which is supposed to be really exciting, but you just lost your job, which is not really exciting. Now you have heightened stress because you love the new baby, but you're just not sure what's going to happen next.
I mean,
Or
the baby has a lot of conflicting emotions too. Like, you're not sleeping, and maybe the baby's crying all the time, and you can be happy about it and really stressed about the baby without the job loss.
yeah, I think these are all good thoughts. I've been consulting with somebody recently who has a hard time accepting that the script that she thought she bought into was not the script she's living. And she's concerned over and over and over again that the other person involved in her script just is not accepting the script anymore. And you can tell that there's this gigantic problem because when you think that things are just going to stay the same forever and they don't, that's disruptive.
Or if you think that you're the director of the play and the people just are not following their parts and you want to influence that, like, don't you know your part? Why are
Yeah,
you playing your part?
exactly. Well, and I think that some of the times we don't understand how dysfunctional the script is. And so because maybe we started with the script and we thought, maybe I guess I can play with this script for a while, but then you realize for a while is potentially forever. And you're like, at some point, there's that chronic burnout where you're just like, I just can't take it anymore. And I don't know how to solve the problem. And I don't know what part I'm supposed to play. And I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. But I understand what I'm supposed to be doing apparently is always the shit show in essence. Like it's always the problem. And so like people start to defect, right? I mean, like your internal system just eventually has enough chronic problems that you're like, I just need a break. And
I'm
I
not
do
playing this game anymore.
right. And so when the other person starts to do things that are clearly signs that they're no longer incorporated in the script the same way, it's super disruptive because it's like you just changed the rules. You didn't get to invite me. You didn't even get to collaborate on it. And the other person's like, look, it is just not negotiable anymore because I don't I can't comprehend how dysfunctional I am, how bad I feel. because of how I have to keep playing this role over and over and over again.
And a lot of times it is a role. Let's say that you have your authentic self and you're refusing to accept that. You're putting on a mask or whatever. You're acting differently for other people. And then finally, you're just like, I have to be me. I can't be another person, not even to
Absolutely.
please you, not even to fit into your play.
Right. And so if the person who's expecting the script to stay the same is in a position of feeling like they needed the care or they needed the strength of the other player, but the other player's like, I just can't be your strength anymore. I can't be your system. I need you to be healthy. And the other person's like, well, I'm not healthy. Like, I'm not ready. Then you feel abandoned because you're like, look, I was doing my side. You can't just stop caring for me. You can't stop loving me. And the other person's potentially like, I'm not saying I don't love you. I'm not saying I don't care about you. I just cannot carry you. I can't carry what you are anticipating I'm supposed to carry anymore. Now that doesn't mean that either person is necessarily wrong because both parties are now starting to react against the system, but that changing of the script unilaterally definitely leaves the person who needed the care, needed the strength, needed the love in a spot of like, now what do I do? And I
Well,
think,
actually, probably both of them. I mean, the person who says I can't do this anymore has to figure out a new plan too.
well, sure, but they're a little bit ahead of the game because they did it without like they defected without participating, right? They decided I have to do this thing.
Yeah.
And it's most likely a reaction because they don't know how to express themselves. And so the reaction becomes um disruptive because it was not expected and not negotiated, right?
I'm going to say one thing about that because maybe they've mentioned it over and over and over, and that repetition has just been tuned out. Like your mom says the same thing over and over, the teenager tunes it out. And so it's
Absolutely.
possible that the person has been communicating or trying to communicate that perspective over a long period of time. And when nothing happens, eventually they're like, well, if they can't hear me that way, then I need to do something. It's action and behavior that will get attention.
Absolutely. Well, and like you're identifying, the repetitive nature is communication, but the fact that it hasn't been acted on is like negation, right? Because the fact that it's able to be ignored negates the fact that it seems relevant. Because if you still moved on and you still played, even after those repetitive communications, it teaches the person communicating almost a learned helplessness because they're just exacerbated by the fact that they're like, I can't apparently communicate and be heard, which creates the boiling point, right? In which they react and then just defect. Um, so yeah, I totally agree with you that there's definitely an element of it's probably been communicated. The
Well, let's
question is,
let's teach a principle then. Because one thing you can do if someone's not hearing you is to say it differently. Maybe the person cannot hear it that way. And if you say it that way 100 times and they don't get it 100 times, you've got to vary it. You have to do it in a way that they can hear.
yeah. Well, I think that thinking specifically about the people in question, I think there's a sense of impatience, right? That they probably deal with the dysfunction, they get over it. Um, and there's that lack of trust in the fact that like I've said it a billion times, you didn't hear me, so why would I say it again? Why would I even say it differently? Why would I be creative? Why would I try? And the other person's like, well, because I really care about you. Like they're willing to try to give the benefit of the doubt, but they also have to own I did railroad you for so many times because what I needed was way more important than what you're communicating, and I wasn't ready to embrace what you're communicating. I needed you to
That's a
stay in your
really good
script.
book about it. I think it was called Why Your Marriage Ends. Shoot, now I can't remember the title. It
No,
was
yeah,
good.
why marriages succeed or fail talks a lot about the the stonewallers have to have the courage to participate, but I don't think that was exactly the book.
The book that I'm talking about was teaching about invalidation. And what I realized when I was thinking about invalidation was that I was invalidating myself. So that I love that book, Loving What Is, that we've talked about before, because you can't change the other person and you just have to own all of it. And so this book was teaching about invalidation. I was like, oh, yeah, it wasn't another person invalidating me only. It was also me saying my feelings aren't important enough to do something about this.
Yeah, well, and which is, I think, which becomes one of the problems. I read the book Leadership and Self-Deception, and it talks about as soon as you do something that's inconsistent with what you would authentically do, then you immediately enter self-betrayal. And
Such
self-betrayal
a good
creates,
book.
it creates a whole bunch of negative kind of like collateral damage because you have to start justifying why you betrayed yourself. And that usually has a bunch of negative baggage. But then you have to justify why you're betraying this person you care about, or this neighbor you care about, or this person who's become an object so you don't have to care about them. So you have to go through a bunch of cognitive dissonance because you know you've acted contrary to your values for whatever reason, right? You might, whatever's happening, but we have to own that we failed ourselves and we also failed the other person. And how do we step into that?
I want to give you the name of this book that I just read. This is How Your Marriage Ends, is the
Oh,
book.
okay.
But to follow up on what you were saying, I think people get a lot of negative feedback when they're authentic, and sometimes they just try to adjust so they don't get that feedback. So I understand that it it makes sense to be authentic, but sometimes it's really hard to be authentic also.
Well, no, I think it's generally always hard to be authentic because until, I mean, at least initially at the beginning, because it's so uncomfortable to be ourselves, right? We
Why
often,
would it be uncomfortable to be yourself? That doesn't
well,
make sense.
I agree it doesn't make sense, but I think particularly for people in conflict or for people inside scripts, I think we innately know what we have to do in order to preserve our system or to preserve continuity or to preserve like general life stasis, right? Like if we just know what's super important to this person we're in conflict with, we say like, I'm not in the mood, screw it. I'm just gonna not worry about this one right now. But the courage, which
Battles.
I think the courage which Gottman talks about in that Why Marriage Succeed or Fail is you should be able to be civil and authentic, which would allow you to be diplomatic and which I think comes into the one of the topics that somebody referred to us, which is our limits and our boundaries, right? That if we recognize we're overtaxed or we're overstressed or we're over relationship, or if we're just not healthy, there should be a way for us to authentically and civilly just say, look, I need some space at the moment. I'm not prepared to have this conversation, or I can see your feelings are valid and that you're upset and like I'm not challenging where you're at. I also just appreciate I can't be there right now. Um, but I want to, so let me come back to this in a minute. Or you might say, I actually don't even know if I want to because I recognize how unhealthy I feel around this topic. but because I care about you, maybe I'm going to try, right? But I think if we stay in that reaction zone where it's all like, atomic in nature and it's going to be nuclear, um, that's that exasperation blow up where if we just said, look, where am I at right now? Why am I not able to process what's happening? I actually did this the other day. I went into my house and I'd had a couple stressful engagements with clients and another I think was with just a bank or something, and I was really off. And I just said, I'm just getting everybody notice. I'm not doing super well right now. I'm irritable, and I'm sure I can be reactive.
Hmm.
And so then something happened later, and they said, so you're really like super annoyed. I said, I already put that out there. And they said, well, are you trying to work on it? I said, I am. That's why I identified that I am super irritable. So,
Don't poke the bear.
but it was funny because I had already stated it and I was actually serious about it. Nobody could say I wasn't trying. And so it did help reset the kind of the expectation of the house because they're like, Dad really is having a bad day. He's not faking it and it's not our problem either. Like I already told them it wasn't their problem, right?
Mhm.
But I think that's part of when we set limits and boundaries, we have to be kind of honest about what's happening or where they're coming from. And also clear with people that like it's not your fault I'm having a bad day. I'm not regulated. Me not being regulated is my fault. So I have to address where I'm at and take responsibility for where I'm at.
So I think one important component of that is that when you're talking to another person, there are two perspectives, and you have to look at both of them. And you sharing your perspective is helpful because the other person can see that perspective. And if both of you are looking at one perspective and not considering the other one, then there's a problem. And you have to figure out how to share that information because if you just consider part of it, you don't see the whole picture.
Exactly. One, and then I'll even say there's a third perspective, which my therapist, he started to add in what would a healthy person do?
Oh, that's a good one.
And or normal, like what would a healthy or normal person do in that situation? Because sometimes when you look at the script, if you say there's not your perspective and my perspective, there's also what would the other person who's not in our conflict do, who's probably healthier because they're not connected to the baggage, they're not connected to the stress, they're not connected to the history. And so, like there's a couple books that make the comment, if you wouldn't let a person treat you that way on your first date, why are you letting them treat you that on your 10th or 32nd year or whatever? Like why does that boundary no longer matter if somebody's going to look at you and go, nobody should be treated like that? So sometimes I've learned a lot from that third option, which is like interesting.
I think having a template or a model is a really good idea. One thing that the mentor I had on conflict resolution taught was a tone of caring, sharing, and loving. And so you compare your behavior, what you say, do, think, all of those things to the standard. If it's not kind, if it's not caring, then it doesn't fit. You can't have a good relationship if you're behaving in ways that are unconstructive all the time.
Absolutely. And I've found kind of in my own life acknowledging that I'm part of the problem is helpful. Like no matter what the other person is or is doing or is whatever, right? Whatever, however exacerbated, name calling, destructive that person is, you get to choose how you engage with it. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean it's not confronting. It doesn't mean it's not alarming, but you also don't have to own it, like
Debbie says you don't have to go to every party you're invited to.
that's a good comment. Yeah, that's really good. We should have her like do one of these.
We totally should.
Yeah, put that on her list. Like she needs to do one of these. Um, because I think that I know on my side when I realized, and this came up in another book I was just listening to. I can't reference where it was from, but the idea that we think we have percentages that we're supposed to do instead of I should just own my life, right? Like I should own 100% of my life. If I come home and somebody has not done what I thought they should do, then that's a thinking error that I actually thought they should do anything, right? That like if I come home and I see something needs to be done, I should probably do it, and I'll do it until I don't want to do it anymore, right? I mean, I get to choose whether that thing is confronted or not. But me necessarily saying this is your problem, you must fix my problem.
Well, part of what you're talking about is trust. So, is this person behaving in a way that I'm expecting? Part of it is habits. We like to do things automatically because that saves a lot of energy. So, these are all topics that we could explore. But for sure, if something's out of the normal and you don't like it, you'll notice.
Yeah, and you get to decide what it means, right? because you could say to this other person, my impression was this was something that you were going to manage as
This is your
something.
job. This is your role. This is your
Yeah,
responsibility.
yeah. And if the person said, yeah, that your impression is totally flawed, then you get to adjust. Or the other person could say, you're correct. I have generally tried to do that thing, but today I'm just super overwhelmed. I appreciate you covering it, right? But even if they're grateful or not grateful or whatever, like sometimes we live in expectation of a response, which is just
Yeah.
totally loaded, right? It's just we shouldn't have to live in anticipation of responses.
Another thing this brings up is invisible work. Let's say you never noticed it or appreciated it before, and then when it stops happening, you're like, what? And that person's like, it took a lot of effort to keep that thing going all the time.
Yeah, and I just
And
didn't want to do it
what about
anymore.
all these other things I do all the time?
Yeah, so that's a good point. What are your thoughts on limits and boundaries? Like, how do you see that as um the track? Like when you started your initial conversation about the track, like how do limits and boundaries tie into life changes and getting off track?
Well, I think a lot of people want to set limits and expect other people to follow those limits. And so it's just really important to remember that boundaries are how you respond. It's not something you tell other people to do.
Right. I agree that it's the limit and boundaries about my conduct or what I would like to experience, not necessarily me just bossing you around because you're in my space.
Yeah, you have this role, so you have to act this way. No, if you do this thing, this is what I'll do, and I'll just do it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'll just do it is what a lot of people don't do, because
We don't have to
thinking
talk about it. If you're
well,
yelling at me, I'll leave.
no, well, thinking about this other couple I'm working with, the one player is like, I've sent 5 texts and the person hasn't responded. And I said, then why are you sending any more texts? Because I really need them to respond. Like I want them back in the system, right? I want to feel loved. I want to be comforted. I want to be supported. I want a relationship. But
Mhm.
it's like, well, but are you not paying attention to what's actually happening? Like whether this person told you or not, if you've sent 5 texts and they're not being responded to, that is communication. That is a person giving you uh, a limit. They're not overtly expressing, but they're definitely expressing. And I think the idea of chasing is so horrible, right? The idea that when we realize we're being abandoned or we
The
realize that
pursuer and the what is that? There's a dynamic there.
I can't remember
A
right now.
distancer and a pursuer. There's something where the person needs some space and the person comes, and they're like, no, I really need space.
Yeah, so and I think it's just so sad, when you find yourself in that position, because I'll identify I've been there where you're the one left and you're kind of like, huh, I
Oh,
mean, like what happened? Like what? Like I don't feel like I had a chance to say or whatever. And the other person's like, no, you've said too much, or if you needed too much, or you're just like it's too much. Like I need some space, and you're like, huh. But learning through therapy and just through self care how to say, oh, I appreciate I heard your message. I'm okay with myself enough that I can step back. I can take a break. I can give you space for whatever you need. If we need to separate, I'm also okay with myself enough that I'm okay with you separating from me. Right. But sometimes our identities get so connected to our limits and boundaries, and uh, it's super difficult when people have to change and it's not unilaterally agreed upon, right?
relationships change all the time. And so if people don't have the resources to be able to change as people change over life, they can get far apart. And, maybe one person wasn't as in touch with the things that they needed and wanted, and then they decide they do. And if that person isn't willing to respond or adjust, it just, the quality of the relationship feels different.
No, absolutely. And I'm listening to a book right now called Wired for Love,
Mm,
and it talks about how a lot of the therapists and the psychologists come at it from the perspective of individuality, saying, well, like let's say you're healthy and your partner's not healthy, then maybe you should get divorced so you can be healthy.
mm.
This guy in Wired for Love also talks about another catalyst being should the marriage be healthy, which is a little bit different than should I be healthy, because it creates a little bit of obligation and loyalty to marriage itself, to a partnership itself, which also creates a little bit different dynamic because you're now not just thinking about yourself or about the other person, but you're thinking about what does your partnership mean on a more global level or on a more, collateral level if it goes badly. Um, and I found that interesting to think of how do we like as a person who might be defecting, right? How do you stay inside a system because the system needs to exist? But how do you also create the limits that make that system important? Because if it's not healthy, it maybe should just die anyway. Like it potentially should die if it's too caustic or if it's too negative or if it's too oppressive. Even James E. Faust, who's he's a former lawyer as well as apostle for the
Religious
Church of Jesus
leader.
Christ of Latter-day Saints. Um, he made the comment, generally speaking, most things should not end unless there's just cause. And he says just cause is when something basically becomes um, it's like your last resort, like it's emotionally unbearable. This he makes this comment in a talk he gave called Father Come Home, something like that.
Mm.
And I thought that just cause is super important when you talk about like if my system, my personal system is going to be debilitated and I basically cannot function anymore because of this partnership, like that is a gigantic warning sign that something has to change. So there definitely are times when a partnership is not as important as the fact that you're going to destroy yourself or be mentally, you know, you're going to be out, right?
I like the metaphor of drowning. The
Yeah,
lifeguard has to save the lifeguard sometimes, even if the other person drowns.
correct. But there could be this other option to say, well, you know, even though I have to defect because of how the system's currently working, should the overall system still be preserved? Like, could the overall system be preserved even though I'm drowning? Is there a way for me to not be drowning and still maybe preserve the system? And that's kind of given me some things to think about because even my psychologist has talked a lot about self-care should probably predominate over the system.
Mm.
But I think from that my therapist's perspective, if you're looking at the way I was responding to a system, he's like, you don't get a system because like you have to become healthy first and then you could build a system, right? And I think like specifically speaking from the perspective of having a head injury and kind of resetting my whole life, it's probably more fair to say until you understand where you fit in your system, you should probably not have a system. Then once you feel like you are healthy enough to start to see your place accurately, then you probably could start to be part of systems.
Well, I mean, are you talking about dissolving already functioning systems? Like when something's unexpected like that and the system was generally okay before that, you don't want the person who's doing better to just bail every time somebody has a major problem. Someone gets cancer. Bye. Like you've got to have some commitment
Well,
and work together.
I think you're correct that there should be some commitment. But what he was identifying is I was trying to preserve the old systems.
Oh, the old, you're talking about the way things were and you have to adjust to the new situation. Okay.
Yeah, so because I couldn't see myself accurately,
Yeah.
I needed to be able to surrender the old systems to whatever extent. Like I needed to be able to back away so I could see what role I was playing in those systems.
You
And
couldn't
then,
expect to do the same things you used to be able to do.
correct. But also there's other people expecting me to do those things, and there's other people relying on me to do certain things. And there's
Mhm.
like for me, there's clients, there's my wife, there's my kids, there's like my extended family, there's I have multiple businesses. And so taking the time to not necessarily burn them down, because I don't think that's what he was saying, but it was the idea of like you have to allow for a period of adjustment so that you can be a new person, so you can be a new thing inside. Because the system is, I think systems are generally adaptable if we don't work on burning them down, right? Like if we just say like even if we just think about living in Utah in a drought system, like this year I've had more fruit than ever, etc. But last year I had hardly any growing season, like everything was burning up and whatever. So sometimes it's almost like
Mhm.
the time, like there's an arc of time that allows things to heal or change or adapt. But if we're expecting everything to happen really fast, then oftentimes we're missing all kinds of things that are probably relevant to that adjustment.
Well, and I think people can also strengthen their resilience. They can prepare. You were talking a little earlier about emotional resources, spiritual resources. There are some things you can do in advance and even during the time to help you make those types of adjustments. Even just backing up and looking at a bigger perspective. Maybe you've got to limit the number of things you do today, but you're still a valuable part of the family. And even if things are different, that doesn't mean that they're bad.
Right. Yeah. And that was another point that came up in some of my therapy was the idea that because I was in a reactive state, I felt like everything went from I can't do it, nuke, just destroy it. And and the therapist never said, "Oh, is that what you should really do?" I mean, he would often say is, well, think about it. And what I started to understand was the distance between like nuclear and whatever. Like there was all kinds of things that could happen. And a lot of times it was just go to bed and wake up tomorrow and just see what else is going to happen. Like it doesn't have to be like, for example, married couples will say, well, the person is just not complying. We're getting divorced. And so
Complying, that word, Travis. What?
yeah, that's what people say. Like they're talking to another woman, like they're just out. They're talking to another man, they're just out. And the distance that doesn't have to be like that, right? And often the fact that we say it overuses it again because we're communicating, I'm desperate, I'm tired, I want out. But it's also like, I don't really, I just want you to change your behavior. And so
Well, one thing that can help that I've been looking at recently is the whole picture, right? Like let's say there are 100 pixels in the picture. Maybe 5 of those are really, really messed up. And then if you look at how many are okay, that can help because if you only look at the 5 that you're like, these are unacceptable, then, I mean, the picture might not be perfect. Maybe we're real, normal, infallible human beings. But if you could look at the big picture and say, look at all the things that are going well, look at all the things that I can do, that can help a lot.
no, I definitely agree that you like not having a laser focus on some things like does help you to realize there's actually a lot that's going pretty good, or now I think that when you come down to a thing that is just kind of like your core value, like if somebody's having an affair or even an emotional affair, and you say, I mean, like, I'm going to give you the healthy response, right? The healthy response of a person who's not feeling betrayed, who feels healthy with themselves, might be, I see that this relationship is important to you. I do not know how it was created. I don't know like why it's important. I feel betrayed by it existing and happening. Like you receiving comfort from somebody else betrays me. Um, I know that there's a lot of good things going on in our lives. Like the business are good, things are good, families are good. But I also have to identify that you having this relationship is not going to work for me. If it's more important than our system, I'll need to defect.
I would never minimize some big things like that.
Yeah, well, but the question is like if you look at loving what is, um, there's some question about what is a big thing? Like they're all just things. And the person starting another relationship, it was done for a reason, right? Like it was done because there was a void, or was done because of like that person went that way. They defected from their relationship for a reason, you know. It may have
Yeah.
been mental health in nature, it may have been convenience in nature, it may have been whatever. Um, and instead of seeing it maybe as just a personal attack on you, like I am betrayed because you did the following, it does take some it takes some courage to understand why a thing happened, right?
Well, you've got to pull yourself back enough so that it's not just an emotional wave hitting you, right? Like you have to have enough distance to look at it with some objectivity.
Yeah, yeah, because and you have to have the objectivity in yourself also. Like, what role did you play? It's not a blame. It's not like we're not like a person who's abused is not being blamed because they're abused. But even as Kate Bronte identifies in her book, they still played a role, right? It's not that they are at fault. It's not like I mean, an adult abusing a child, the child is not at fault. But there is some. I was surprised in her book. She identified this situation, and I was like, you cannot ask the child to own any of it. But unfortunately, in this situation, the child immediately owned it. I mean, she's like, the person was like 35 or 40 reliving this abuse. And she says, tell me what part was yours. And the lady immediately responded with the part that was hers.
Hmm.
And I was literally flabbergasted that it could be done that way, right? So when you
But
think
that's
about
what gives you the empowerment, Travis. If the victim can't do anything ever, then you're still a victim. If you
yeah,
say, I can do something, even if I'm in the concentration camp and I have nothing and I'm trapped and these people all have machine guns around me, but I can choose what I'll do. I can choose what I think. I can choose my the way I face this challenge, then it gives you the dignity,
it gives you something. Like
gives you something.
it's definitely a conflicted dignity because the in this case with Kate Bronte, the girl said, I knew I could get whatever I wanted from the store. So because the perpetrator did not want it to be disclosed, she blackmailed him with getting gifts and candy and ice cream and stuff. You know, how
Ugh.
horrific for an 8-year old to have to like go through that. But she knew how to empower herself despite her problem, right? I mean, it was okay, but anyway, we're not trying to justify that. But if you say my husband's having an affair, even an emotional affair, what circumstances could I have played a role in? Not again blaming me because the husband owns the choices, right? The husband chose the affair. What role may I have played in facilitating this situation? Not that I have to own the other person's choices, but did I play a role in that?
And also just putting yourself in today. Like you can look at those things and learn, but where are we at right this minute?
Right.
How can I be mindful? What am I going to do about it is the boundary, right?
Yeah.
He had an affair. What am I going to do right now about it?
Right.
How
Because
can I protect myself because I'm in that scenario?
absolutely, because even though the person may have defaulted to an affair, you still don't have to accept it, even if you played any kind of role in it, right? Like you could say, I I acknowledge I may have done the following things, and you made a choice based upon a reaction to the things I was doing or not doing. I still don't have to accept that you are doing that, and it's definitely not okay with me, and I feel betrayed because like it's a pretty high level of betrayal. Right. And so if the other person's like, well, I needed somebody strong and this person was just there for me, like they were strong. You're like, that's still fine. They can be strong, but I don't have to accept that. Well, if I get rid of this relationship because we haven't done anything, I'll have to get rid of all relationships. That would be a choice. If you have other, female or other relationships that are that important to you, that you can't allow me to feel secure in our relationship because of the way you express yourself in those relationships, yeah, that's fine. You don't get to have me and multiple relationships, even particularly this one that's special and important to you, right? But it's that ability to set limits and boundaries civilly, you know, identifying the perspectives, identifying where things are at, not challenging them as personal confrontations to yourself, because another person's choices is a reflection of that person's choices, right? That person's place, that person's um, wherever they're at, right?
I think this is where we need to talk about assumptions too, because these boundaries are not always explicit and some are more obvious than others. There's a generally expected fidelity part of marriage, but people make a lot of assumptions about a lot of different things in relationships, and it's important to check in.
Absolutely. And I think um, the covert assumptions are often very toxic because again, we're talking about the undefined script. Like these are the things I expected were going to happen, but I did not ever say them to you, right?
Don't you know what I was expecting? You
Yeah,
had
why
all
would
these
it?
jobs.
Yeah, like when somebody says, like, why wouldn't you just have anticipated that? I'm not going to anticipate anything. I mean, and that was one of the healthy things that my therapist brought up with me was stop anticipating anything. Like if
Mm.
you have an expectation, you have to have the courage and the discipline and the diplomacy to identify it. And if it's covert, like you have to own that it was covert, right? Because the fact that you're pissed that it didn't happen is not that other person's fault or their whole system's fault or like your employee's fault or whatever, right? Like you do have the obligation, if it means that much to you, to express that. So I think what are experiences you've had with that?
With expressing expectations?
Like where you maybe had to overcome it or you've had to like you identified that you had covert, but you had to change that.
So I think a useful concept here is comfort. Is this relationship comfortable? Is this interaction comfortable? And then you have to identify what is it exactly that's uncomfortable about it. Is it the tone of voice? Is it the choice of words? Like looking at these types of things. And then why is it uncomfortable? Is it because it's inappropriate? Is it because I just have a different preference? So these are all things I think about because I really like having good relationships. So I think it's helpful to have some types of frameworks to look at
So
for
do you
things like
do you
that.
think at times that you said you worry about relationships, do you think you overthink the covert rules?
I overthink everything. It's my favorite.
Okay. So how,
Uh,
how do you back away from overthinking all the unwritten rules?
I think I just have to recognize that there's the idealistic standard and there's the template, and then just being compassionate and recognizing that people don't fit that ideal all the time. And I'm reading this book right now about radical kindness, and it says first you have to look at you. So something that helped me a lot was just to be compassionate with myself, and instead of being like still not measuring up, still messing up, I could be like, I'm trying really hard, I'm doing a good job, I'm better than I was yesterday. And just the kind of self-talk that's kind. And then when I can be okay with my own imperfections and flaws and foibles, then I can accept that other people are okay right now. They don't have to be at whatever standard when I want them to be at that standard. They can just be who they are, and that's enough, and that's great. Like, I'm glad they're part of my lives. I appreciate their perspectives.
Yeah, I think that you're the ultimate, because I used to overthink relationships a lot. Uh, and I think, like if somebody didn't respond to an email for a while, I'd be like, wonder what's going on? Like, did I do something? Did something happen? And so like I'd even email them back and say, hey, are we good? Like I sent you that email. They're like, yeah, we're fine. And I started, I mean, and this was part of a codependent phase where I was in where, I'm just kind of like when you're kind of worried about the world being in order, and then things that you thought would reverberate or not reverberating, you're like, well, what happened? Who broke it? Like, what's going on? Like, how do I get that thing back on track? And
Yes, that over responsibility. If there's a problem, I must be able to do something about it.
right. So I realize now I will just say, am I minding my business? Like, am I fine? And then I'll also ask, how would a normal person feel about this?
I wouldn't even pretend to know how a normal person would feel about things or think about things. But what I try and do is just look at I'm okay. Like, whether or not that person responds the way I want to, I can take care of myself. I can distract. I can find someone else who will give me attention or who will love me or appreciate me, or I can feel accomplishment from doing a task, or,
Yeah.
like, I can help myself and I
Well,
can
but I
interact
think what I'm saying, like when you
socially.
think about what a normal person would do, sometimes that helps me step back and say, okay, when did I send the email? Like, what would a normal response time be? Was the email I sent actually important? Like, were they expecting to respond? Um, like you could, I think having that peripheral perspective allows you to add in other variables by way of measuring the data, right? Like you're able to measure um, what did I actually say? What did I actually communicate? Because sometimes if somebody responds to what I say, I'll go back and read it and just go, oh, I apologize. I can see how that would be whatever, right? So if we own the way we approach covert contracts, we don't know how our history has created them. But if we actually hear how people are responding or we ask for clarification how they're responding, then we can say, oh, I appreciate I did not mean to send that message. Or sometimes, if somebody calls out and says, that was a covert contract, you're like, I apologize. It actually was. I was totally trying to manipulate you. I mean, I don't think I've never said that myself specifically, but I think when we get to the point that we have courage to identify that was what was communicated, I see that. I appreciate that we can address that.
And I thought you brought up a good point that sometimes you just ask, like, instead of assuming that that person didn't want to respond to you, you could just be like, hey, notice, maybe you call instead of emailing. You're like, does that mean you never want to talk to me again, or did you just get distracted?
Yeah, because I do have an individual who I know can get a little bit dark, and you can recognize in his communication some things you're like, huh. And so I'll play the game a little bit where I'm like giving I'll pretend like we're going along normally, but I can sense and see in the communication that it's not normal. So like you just said, I'll call him and I'll be like, okay, what's the problem? Like what's going on? Like what's wrong? And what I think super valuable is that when you have a system that is in fact important, right? A partnership or a marriage or a business that needs to exist, it needs to survive the lemon, right? It needs to survive the change. I think most often we will give each other grace until something happens that is problematic. And then that's like, I think a huge warning sign would be is when the grace has disappeared, then something is really broken, right? Because I think generally speaking, if somebody's having a bad day and we care about them, like it shouldn't be super hard to be authentic about caring about them.
Right.
Even if you need boundaries or some limits to say, look, I can see you are in pain right now. I have to finish this meeting and then I'll be right over, or I'll call you right after and I'll spend some time with you. So I'll be able to give you quality time versus I just can't carry your water anymore. Like, just suck it up. Like, that would be a communication that the partnership is not doing very well.
Yeah.
So that's good. So we're about at the top of the hour. So I'm gonna stop recording this, but I appreciate everybody tuning in. This should appear on YouTube, and we do this every month, and we have a great time. If you don't feel comfortable joining our program, you can always text us or shoot us messages about what you'd like to have us talk about. We're okay having vicarious conversations about you in public.
Let's mention the other topics we discuss
Okay, go ahead.
in other classes. So we have a class called uh, Startup Toolbox.
Yeah, Startup Toolbox.
It's about small businesses and about increasing your income. And then we have strategic manifestation, that's about manifesting good things in your life.
Yeah, your goals.
And then we'll start our reading group,
Yeah,
where we talk about interesting books.
I'm very excited about this one because it is not a specific book club. It is readers, so it's called a readers book club, meaning uh, I like to read. So when I come to a book club, I generally don't talk about one book, and people are like, well, look, you're off topic. And I'm like, well, look, it's like all these books. So this a readers book club is for readers who just want to come and talk about maybe the books that they've come in. I'm gonna brag, but also just say like I don't know if it's quite bragging, but I've hit over 200 books already this year because that's how I read, and I just love it. And I guess I'm bragging about getting inside the library and inside books. I think it's super fun. Another group we're gonna have is called uh, Fill Your Lamps, which is a book on preparedness and awareness. So this is a book that, I'm sorry, a group that is about how do we pay attention to what we need to address by way of filling up our lamps. It is a reference to the New Testament concept of the 10 virgins and their lamps. But I think it also just relates to our lives and how, are we centered with ourselves and with God and with where we're supposed to be, but then are we also taking care of the responsibilities we have to take care of in our lives?
So completely non-denominational, open to any
Absolutely.
type of spiritual tradition. You don't have to believe in the New Testament to participate.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely not denomination specific.
But we will bring up references.
Yeah, I think we welcome the conversation, just people generally talking about how they connect with, God. I think and whether God is male or female is irrelevant, and whether um you're Buddhist or whatever does not matter. It's just, there's some kind of, I think there is generally a spiritual connection idea in it. The final class is called conflict coaching. So this is where we talk about specific areas of conflict, and we talk about how you might strategically get through that conflict, or how you might yourself prepare yourself for conflict, or maybe you're in a system and you're trying to work on group dynamics of conflict. This today, you could probably say that this relates a little bit to what we've been talking about by way of conflict, but this is a lot of internal conflict. Like the lemons are those internal conflicts with yourself and where you're at in your system by way of how do I deal with my role in a system that's changing, whether I wanted it to or not, or whether I changed it, but everybody else around me is freaking out. So anyway, I love these discussions, and I really enjoy doing them with America. I think we have a good time, and Steward Growth is a great organization. If you want to know more about that, you can go to stewardgrowth.com and connect with us. If you want to volunteer, get involved. We love to help people start businesses as well as start nonprofits, and also help their nonprofits or businesses excel as well as themselves personally. So this is part of our
And we
mission.
have several Facebook groups that we'd love you to participate in.
Absolutely. All right. We'll see you next time.